My name is Joe Lauer, and I'm a corn agronomist at the University of Wisconsin. Right now, the projections are to have a very low price outlook, and this is part of a series to address some of those concerns. What I want to start with is what I want to talk about really is just the yield limiting factors and profitability limiting factors that are typically encountered with corn production. We've enjoyed a number of good years, and now we're kind of back to the future, if you will, in terms of our price outlook and profitability. But if you were to look at the yield limiting factors in corn, it's really not about inputs. What it's about really is hybrid selection more than anything. And as you'll see in a little bit, hybrid selection is really what dictates our management style as we go through any production season. Really, once we pick a hybrid and kind of decide on the management style that we want to have, the main objective then is to reduce the amount of stress on corn during the growing season. And so that becomes, the question then becomes just how do we do that? Well, as I mentioned, we're kind of back to the future in terms of the prices that are projected versus the production costs that we've got out there. The yields are very good, have been very good the last few years, but of course the corn price has gone down quite a bit. And really, where everything needs to start is you need to know your costs. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go through the presentation. Then what I always say as well is concentrate on the basics, just the basics of corn production. And really a lot of the decisions you make comes down to timing and what to do when and where. And then finally, every decision that you make, you really need to ask yourself, why are you doing this particular operation, or why are you making this kind of decision? Many decisions oftentimes, especially as we start to look at extra inputs, really may be difficult to have a return on investment down the road. First of all, the cost of production for corn. This slide here shows the USDA estimates for the northern crescent area, which Wisconsin is a part of the Great Lakes, and you can see that there have been a number of costs that have really increased dramatically. One, of course, is seed. Used to be around $20 an acre. Now we're up to well over $100 an acre for seed. Another one is fertilizer that has really increased over time. Finally, equipment and land costs have also been fairly big movers in terms of the cost of production for corn. Some things that really haven't changed very much, though, are chemicals. The overhead associated with any production, usually we figure about 15 to 20% overhead. This would be things like tools in your shop, plowing the driveway, anything that needs to be run for the business to run is considered overhead. And then finally, the labor really hasn't changed all that much in terms of the cost per hour over time. This is what we see for Wisconsin. This next slide here shows what is going on in the Corn Belt, the Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Nebraska parts of the country. And you can see that in general, the cost of production is, as far as the trends, have been very similar. However, there are higher land costs. Equipment seems to be a little bit higher as well too. And that's really the difference between what we see in Wisconsin versus other parts of the Corn Belt. There are slight differences out there. Now, when we think about different decisions, we kind of categorize these into three different types of decisions. And really, the success of those decisions is going to be dependent upon weather, the timing that you're able to do some of those operations, as well as the economics. These are all going to drive the success of those decisions. One group of decisions is what I just call categorical. You either do it or you don't. You either rotate corn or onto corn ground, onto soybean ground, or you grow continuous corn. You either do no-till or you do some chisel plowing or more aggressive kinds of tillage. These are all examples of categorical types of decision variables. Another type is something called continuous variables, where the amount of the input is really, there's quite a range in terms of the amount of the input that's required for that decision. For example, plant density, we know that in some parts of the state we can go down as low as 26,000 plants to the acre and still have a fairly good yield. In other parts of the state it's higher than that. So these are kind of decision that is kind of along a continuum. And then there's something that I just call optional variables. These are things that aren't really needed oftentimes to be successful at growing corn, but oftentimes they help with some of the decisions a little bit. I want to show you just an example here of what happens with continuous variables, or one example here of continuous variables, and how to think about this a little bit. This slide here, what we're going to do is look at the maximum yield versus the economic yield, and we're going to use plant population as the input here. Generally, as we increase our plant population, we get to an optimum, and then as you go higher than that optimum, yield oftentimes will decrease. Now, when you look at the cost of that particular input, that cost is pretty much a linear increase. In other words, as you increase for every 1,000 seeds that you put out there per acre, that's going to be pretty much a linear kind of an input into that production. Now, the top of the yield curve is where we achieve our maximum yield, and this is point A here. And this can slide a little bit along that yield continuum there. But that's one point on this curve that we're really interested in. And you should know this really for every field. You should know what population gives you your maximum yield on a high ridgetop versus something that's more in a lower part of the farm. And this varies probably from field to field. The important point here, though, is the economic optimum. And usually that economic optimum is lower than where that maximum yield occurs. And what we're really looking at here is the distance between this green curve and where the cost is, right here. And whenever that's as far as it can be or as wide as it can be, that gives us our economic optimum. There's two other points to kind of pay attention here about. One is what we call the equilibrium yield, where the cost of the input basically equals the cost of the yield that you get. And with corn, we're never really getting there. We in our program, we'll test up to 120,000 plants to the acre, and we still can get some fairly high yields at that high of a population. But obviously, the input cost is going up quite a bit. And then one other point is what's happening down at the origin, or the origin of the graph. And this is the yield with no input. Now with plant density, if you have 0 plants out there, you've really got 0 yield. But there are some inputs like nitrogen, for example, where you can put 0 nitrogen out there and yet you'll still get that yield curve intercepting at a higher rate. And sometimes 50 to 70 bushels is what can be produced with 0 nitrogen. I'll show you an example of this in a little bit. And then when we talk about some of these categorical types of decisions, really what we're talking about is just a small change that goes on between where that maximum yield and where the economic optimum is. So for example, with tillage, with no-till, in all the trials that we've done, we only see about a 7% yield decrease from where the maximum yield occurs with chisel plowing. Okay, so this is kind of the example of where these categorical decisions come in a little bit. But this gives you an idea of how to think about some of these different decisions, especially for a continuous variable. Now what I'd like to do here is go through a number of decisions. I'm going to just go through 10 here, go 8 into fairly detail. And I'm going to start with the number one driver, of course, is weather. In the Midwest here, we're challenged by wet springs, and this is a case where drainage is very critical, and we're seeing a lot of fields getting drained more and more in Wisconsin. That's in the spring. In the summer, we're oftentimes challenged with dry and hot conditions during pollination, and especially during grain filling, during the late August and late July and early part of August. I always think that you got to know what to pray for, and here's ideally what we need for corn to do well. In the spring, you need dry enough weather for early planting, but it's got to be wet enough to be able to activate herbicides in order to get good stands and uniform emergence. Actually, a mini drought in the month of June is not a bad thing, but beginning about that third week of June, first week of July, we need to be getting timely rains, and 1 inch per week is generally what's needed for the corn crop at that time. And then in the fall, hot or sunny, dry weather helps to speed up that harvest and get that corn down to 22% moisture so that we can store it during the season. So this is what you need to be praying for as far as the weather goes and corn production. But ultimately, we really have to accept the fact that Mother Nature has the upper hand here, and keep that in mind. And oftentimes what we're doing is reacting to what Mother Nature gives us. This slide here gives you a sense of what goes on when we really don't have a lot of inputs. This data here is some data from Lancaster, where there's been 0 nitrogen applied since 1966. And this first line that I'm going to show you here is continuous corn. And you can see that just putting seed out there and planting and keeping the weeds fairly well controlled, we can get anywhere from about 50 to 100 bushels per acre of green with really no inputs at all. Okay. Now, when we rotate corn on the soybean ground, and again apply 0 nitrogen to that corn ground, we can increase our yields due to that rotation effect. Okay, and we increase those yields about 50 bushels or so over that of continuous corn. And then finally, if we can even have a more extended rotation, oftentimes we'll see an even more added benefit. This is corn basically following alfalfa, but it's in a longer kind of a rotation. And again, 0 nitrogen applied to any of these plots in any phase or any year with this data. And you can see that in some years we're getting up around 200 bushels to the acre with really no nitrogen input into this set of plots. Okay, so that's kind of the effect of weather and kind of the range that we can see. Now, another decision is selecting your corn hybrid. And increasingly, the hybrid that we pick is dictating the management style that we've got, that we can have out there. With these transgenic lines that we have, there's a lot of different options that growers have that influence, for example, pest control down the road in terms of weeds or insects. We now are starting to see some of the drought guard technologies come out. But selecting this hybrid is a very important decision. We've always encouraged, for years, university agronomists have encouraged using independent yield trial and a multi-location average. Our hybrid trial books provide that sort of information for you, but there are other places as well, things like the FIRST group. WAPAC also provides an overall multi-location average. Then we say evaluate the consistency of performance. If a hybrid ever falls down in any trial, try to find out why it failed in that trial. But by choosing just multi-location averages, good multi-location averages, you can expect to make good progress over time with hybrids that perform that way. In the transgenic era, though, we've had to add, I think, 3 other principles, if you will. First of all, every hybrid's got to stand on its own for performance. And what we mean by that is you just can't switch out different transgenic technologies into family backgrounds. There are interactions of these different technologies or traits that interact with the underlying germplasm, and we'll see 20 to 30 bushel swings all in with hybrids from the same family. And this we feel is significant. And every hybrid's got to stand on its own. If you buy a double stack hybrid and get delivered a triple stack hybrid, that may not be a good deal for you, even though that triple stack, that third trait, is free. If it's a poor performer, you might actually go backwards a little bit. Finally, pay attention to seed costs. Well, what I typically see is that if you have a difference of $50 to $75 a bag between one hybrid and another hybrid, it's very difficult to justify paying for that more expensive hybrid. This is a big departure from what extension agronomists have recommended in the past. We always would recommend going with a better performer even though it might be a little bit more expensive. And finally, buy the traits you need. Not all hybrids, we don't need all the traits that some of these hybrids come with. For example, in northern Wisconsin, we oftentimes don't need the corn rootworm trait, for example, up in the north. Finally, keep this in mind, that traits do not add to yield. What traits do is they protect yield, and this is important as we wrestle with these with hybrid selection nowadays. I put this slide up just to give you a sense of what the economics are of this decision. The public program at the University of Wisconsin started in 1973. We've conducted 886 early and late trials since that time. The average yield across all those trials is 165 bushels. And the difference between the top hybrid and the bottom hybrid in a trial is 71 bushels to the acre. Now, even if that was only half, let's just say it's 35 bushels to the acre, that's a big economic swing when you're basing that decision really at your kitchen table in the wintertime. Picking this hybrid is a very important aspect to profitability for corn. And again, this is just the typical range that we'll see among the hybrids that we are commercially testing. I wanted to spend just a little bit of time on what's happening with conventional hybrids within our trials. This slide here shows kind of the time along the bottom here, and then this axis here is the performance of conventional hybrids in relation to the trial average. Now, the trial average sits right along here. Now, we would expect any group of hybrids, whether they be smart stacks or BT corn borer traded products or conventional hybrids, to fall right on this line here. That's what we would expect. Okay, and when we look at the performance of conventional hybrids, for a lot of years, that's where they were falling out. But beginning about 2000, 2001 or so, the conventional hybrids started yielding below the trial average. Now, this little bar here means that if it touches this line here, that it's not statistically different from the trial average. And you can see for a lot of years, the conventional hybrids were below the trial average when you looked at all the hybrids. Beginning about 2009, 2010, those conventional hybrids started coming back again a little bit. They dropped down in 2011 and 2012, back again for 3 years. And then in 2016, last year, they dropped down again a little bit. So we've seen this kind of decrease go on when we look at all the hybrids in a trial. But really from your perspective as a farmer, really you don't care about all the hybrids. What you care about is what's going on in that top group. So if I discard the bottom 80% of the hybrids and just look at what's going on with the top 20%, recalculate a mean, and if that technology is not in that top 20% group, take the best technology, of best conventional hybrid in this case, and put it in there. This is what it looks like. In that top group, we will oftentimes have, especially more recently, conventional hybrids performing as good as the trial average among those top 20%. But again, you can see for a lot of years it kind of fell off. It got as bad as being almost 18 to 20 bushels below the trial average. But again, more recently, these conventional hybrids are back. They're doing well. and we seem like we're back onto the yield march when it comes to conventional hybrids. So just some things to think about as you pick your hybrid for this coming season. One of the other things I'd like to encourage you to spend a little bit of time evaluating are the seed treatments that go on to corn. First of all, we always need a fungicide. Whenever we don't have a fungicide on corn seed, we will see anywhere from 25 to 30% death of corn. And fungicides in Wisconsin are very important to have on the seed. But there are a lot of other products that are coming on as well too. Things like nematicides or nematostats, micronutrients, insecticides. All these are also being applied to the seed. And the results sometimes are kind of mixed. The trouble that we have with this is that we can't predict very well what kind of problems you're going to have in the spring. For example, the seed corn maggot is a insect that oftentimes only has a flare-up of population in a field every 7 years or so, and it's really hard to predict when that's going to occur. So oftentimes growers now are putting on a fungicide and an insecticide, and the point I'm trying to drive home here is that this is important. It's a difficult decision to make, but you need to be doing something out there when it comes to protecting that seed, protecting that investment the coming year. And what we want to do is get that corn seed off to a good start in terms of early spring growth. Fourth decision is just involved with crop rotation. This is, from a profitability standpoint, typically, this is probably the easiest yield you can get, and I call it the gift that keeps on giving. If you're rotating corn, you can expect to see on a soybean ground or wheat ground, you can expect to see a 10 to 19% yield increase with this kind of a decision. This rotation will last at most 2 years, and it really depends on the length of the break between in the off corn years. For example, if we only have a 1 year soybean break, for example, that second year of corn doesn't yield as much. It yields basically the same as continuous corn in another series of plots. So this is again something very important. This rotation effect lasts at most 2 years, but it's even more dramatic when we have a stressful year. The drought of 2012 was an example where anything that was rotated typically was able to get through that stress period until the rains came on July 18th, and those plots did very well in that particular year. This is what we see with this, though. Here we've got first year corn following 5 years of beans. Over here is a corn-soybean rotation. Then we got the second year of continuous corn, third year, fourth year, fifth year of continuous corn. Then we've got here continuous corn that's been grown since 1983. So this is data up to 2015. So it's almost 30 years of continuous corn on these plots here. And you can see that the rotation effect really is very similar when you rotate corn and beans and when you rotate that first year of corn following 5 years of beans. The second year, we still see a response. The second year corn is higher yielding than the third year corn. But by that third year, you're basically at continuous corn yield levels of corn that has been in place for over 30 years or so. And this is what we call the rotation effect, and it's most dramatic in that first and second year following either corn or wheat, or especially alfalfa. These next bars here are the response that we see with conventional till and no-till, and I'm going to come back to this in a little bit, but the increase that we see in this trial is about 8%, or 8 bushels per acre. With continuous, with chisel plowed or conventional tillage, the yield's 204 bushels, and then over 30 years of no-till, we've seen about an 8 bushel decrease with no-till. So it's a relatively small change, but again, it's kind of one of these categorical decisions that that you either do it or you don't. Of course, the expense of doing conventional tillage is probably going to make this no-till a lot more economically optimum. Okay, a fifth decision is planting date, and this is what sets up your season. Being ready to go so that when the field conditions warrant is important for getting that crop off to a good start. If you're late here, oftentimes the economics of this is that you lower your yield, and then in the fall of the year, you also end up with higher moisture oftentimes. And so you get a double whammy, if you will, of lower yields as well as that higher drying costs in the spring of the year. Now, do you go too early or too late? Well, again, you really need to just look at the field conditions that are there. What we see is that after April 20th in the south, if field conditions warrant, don't worry about soil temperature, just go. And that magic date in the northern part of the state is around April 30th or so. This is some data that kind of shows this here. We call it the maximum grain yield here for April 28th. This is at Arlington. But this is a number of years of data. This is about 11, 12 years of data here. Well, we've planted as early as March in some years. But typically we'll see that maximum yield occurring right around May 1st. In this data set here, it's about April 28th. We're still within 95% of our maximum yield as far out as about May 10th or so. But after that, we really start to lose yield, and it's an accelerating rate. We're only losing about a half a bushel out here, but by the end of May and the beginning part of June, we're losing 2 to 3 bushels an acre as we get into those late May, early June planting dates. So this is, again, something that sets up your season. It can affect you in the fall of the year as well. And again, it's important. One of the things too is the risk that's associated with this. When you plant in here, there's as much risk planting April 15th or April 20th as there is May 1st or May 10th. The risky part of corn production is when we get into these May and June planting dates. We'll see more risk associated with those planting dates than we do early on. And that's because of what goes on in the fall of the year and the killing frost associated with some of these later planting dates. Okay, another thing, and I'm not going to go into this in very much depth. I know Carrie and others are going to talk about this, but I do want to say a few things about soil fertility in relation to corn. This is not where you cut costs. Okay, corn is especially nitrogen loving, and you want to make sure that you have adequate fertility out there when it comes to soil fertility and corn production. Follow extension recommendations. We've done a number of trials where we have put on a lot of fertility, and really the university recommendations give us just as good a yields as some of these plots that have got extra fertility on them. Soil testing is always important, and where you can apply the cheapest form of nutrients usually is good enough. And again, I wouldn't use a lot of micronutrients unless the soil test recommends it. But these are just general recommendations, and I know Carrie's going to go into more depth with this in her part of the presentations. Another decision is what I just call plant distribution in the field. This is really a function of 3 different things: plant density, the row spacing that you've got, and in general with corn, narrower is better, but corn is still a row spacing kind of a crop. It will perform just about as well at 30 inches as 20 inches. You do gain a little bit. It's around 3 to 3.5% or so. But in general, if you're at 30 inches, that's it'll certainly be better than 36 or 38 inches. And then plant that seed about 1.5 to 2 inches. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this plant density decision. And it kind of comes down to this in terms of plant density. It really comes down to what you want to use that corn for. If we look at a number of trials, this is 10 years of work at Arlington here, and so this is for one farm. And if we graph this out, what we'll see is that the maximum yield for grain is right around 39,000 plants to the acre. Okay, but when we calculate the seed costs that are associated with that and look at the economics, the economic optimum for plant density is around 35,000 plants to the acre. So we've dropped about 34,000 plants to the acre for when we look at the economics. Now, this probably varies by field. In other words, a ridgetop or a sandy field is going to be different than a low spot or a valley field on a farm or a heavier clay loam type of a soil. So it's important to know where you maximize your yield, at what plant density you maximize your yield. Once you know that, then you would back off about 4,000 to 5,000 plants to the acre, typically, to get at that economic optimum yield. Okay, and as I said, it varies a little bit by the use you're going to have. For silage or forage, we see the maximum yield at about 48,000 plants to the acre. Milk per ton, though, is maximized at the lowest plant population, or in this case here, about 18,000 plants to the acre. And when you combine the two, your milk per acre in this example is maxed out at about 45,000 plants to the acre. Okay, so again, depending on your use and how you're going to use that corn silage, you would probably be looking at adjusting that plant density a little bit. Now, one of the things to keep in mind here, though, is that we are within 95% of that maximum yield at a fairly wide range of populations. For example, the economic optimum for grain, we can be at that 95. We can be within 95% of that yield at about 25 to 26,000 plants to the acre. For forage yield, we can be there at about 32,000 plants to the acre. So this is a very broad-shouldered response that we see with plant density. And all I've given you here is kind of where the maximum in the economic is. But if we want to be within 5% of that maximum, we can be there even somewhere between 25 and 30,000 plants to the acre for a lot of these different uses and decisions here. So something to think about. Okay, eighth decision, pest control. And again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because there will be others that will talk about this in more depth. I just want to, from where I sit, give a perspective of what I look for in some of these fields. First of all, in corn at least, weeds are much more difficult to control than insects, and insects are much more difficult to control than diseases. In corn, we have a lot of breeding effort that goes into developing resistance to diseases, and that helps. And so when we talk about applying a fungicide, oftentimes I get kind of skeptical because we can oftentimes control a lot of those diseases just by the hybrid that we select or pick at our kitchen table in the wintertime. Okay, now when you look at soybeans, diseases are much more important, and this order might be very different as you go around crops. But for corn, our main issue is really with weeds. And scouting and timeliness are key here. Being timely with your herbicide applications or weed control is very important, especially early in the growing season. And I just can't emphasize that enough. There is, and again, this will be gone into by others a lot more, but keep in mind the economic injury level, the economic threshold levels that are out there. And again, these are just some of the principles that are involved as we start to deal with pests that are out there. You may or may not have insect and diseases next year. You more than likely are going to have weeds. So knowing what those thresholds are and having good weed control early will be a benefit. Number 9, tillage. This is one of those decisions, I think, that you could really save a lot of money. However, I would resist the urge to throw away your chisel plow. The economic swing that the data that I've seen is somewhere between $40 to $150 an acre, depending on how you prepare that field and the kind of tillage that you use in that field. We used to think about tillage in terms of controlling weeds and seedbed preparation, but really now it's only about getting that seedbed ready for stand establishment. We do have more and more issues coming on now with compaction, but we have a lot of tools available to us now that we can use to get good stands in relatively little tillage, especially when we rotate onto corn ground. So what I typically say is that tillage is really not necessary except when we get into continuous corn, and then you may want to pull out your chisel plow a little bit. But the response we're talking about is relatively small. You saw the 8 bushel increase in the one experiment. If we average out all of our studies, what we're looking at is about a 5 to 7% yield swing, depending on whether you do tillage or don't do tillage. That's pretty small, really, when you look at some of the other decisions that have to be made out there. And this is the data, and this is the example that I want to show here with this. You've already seen this yield response that goes on with corn in rotation. So in other words, when you grow corn in the corn-soybean rotation, the yields are basically the same as that first year corn following 5 years of beans. Yields go down the second year and the third year as well, and basically by that third year you're at continuous corn yield levels. But look what happens when you add the tillage variable. This is conventional till right here. When we do the same sort of plots with no-till, typically what we'll see is that no-till, there's really no difference at all between no-till and conventional till when we're early in that rotation. But as we grow more and more continuous corn, that becomes that's really when we start to probably do more conventional tillage. We take about a 13 bushel yield hit in that second year of corn, and about a about a 27 bushel or 17 bushel yield hit in the third year of corn, and it pretty much stays the same the rest of the way through. But what's interesting is what's happening in these early years here. If you're rotating corn, you really don't need to do tillage. It's only as you go deeper into continuous corn rotation that you need to do some tillage to bring those yields back, but you never really overcome the rotation effect, even with tillage. So something to keep in mind. This is what we call the rotation by tillage interaction. And again, if you're rotating, you don't need to do tillage, and you can save yourself $40 to $150 an acre with not having to do those tillage operations. Finally, the last point I'd like to make is harvest and store carefully. There is a trade-off that occurs with harvesting. We recommend the wetter you harvest, the more drying costs you have. The drier you harvest, the more ear loss you have and shattering that goes on. So we typically recommend harvesting between 20 and 25% moisture. You'd need to dry down corn typically for safe storage for a long period of time, and that needs to be below 15%. But most of that drying typically is occurring in October and November. Really by the middle of December, there isn't a lot more drying that goes on until we get out to the spring of the year. Then we get a little bit more drying that can occur. But a lot of that drying is pretty much done by the time we hit really the middle of November, and yet I still see a lot of fields out that haven't been harvested yet, and now those growers are taking on a lot of risk in terms of potential yield loss that can occur. So to kind of wrap up and summarize here, this slide here kind of gives you a sense of the yield swings that can go on just with some of these different decisions. With hybrid, it's about a 0 to 30% change, a 70 bushel yield swing. Depending on the kind of traits you got on there, that can add up to a 0 to 100% yield swing, just depending on the hybrid that you pick. Pests are also kind of like that. If you don't control weeds or insects come in, you can have up to 100% yield swing based on the kind of yield on the kind of damage that you have. Plant density, we see between a full stand and a half stand, about a 22% yield swing. With rotation, it's up 0 to 30%, depending on the kind of environment you got. Planting date, it's a 0 to 30% swing in terms of yield. Soil fertility is about 20 to 50%. Tillage is one of those small things. Around 5 to 7% is typically what we'll see, but again, it's not as big as some of these other decisions. And another one is row spacing. On average, it's about 3%, but there really isn't a lot of yield swing that goes on with that particular decision. So again, these are some things to think about. It kind of comes back to the basics when we have these low margin years, and making sure that what you're doing out there is done in a timely manner and using the best information that you can. So with that, I'll stop. We have a number of different things that we do during the season to help inform people of what we see in our plots that are scattered around the state. And if you want to follow us, please do so at these different sites. You can also subscribe to our website, and then also point out the high root performance trial data that was published this past year. So with that, thank you for listening, and good luck in 2017.